Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be doing my power rankings for the APAC region following the most recent tournament, the first tournament of the season, the Kickoff Clash. Now, obviously, last time I did these power rankings, I started with the Western region and then did the Eastern APAC region second, so we're going to be flipping it this time and doing the APAC region first and the Western region second. Fewer teams in the Eastern region, so I think it's a little bit easier to get this one out to you guys first. Just before we get started, I want to just make a couple things known. I really heavily weight what we saw in the tournament. Now, obviously, the tournament didn't have everything. Some things were not going to be obvious. But in some cases, some of you guys may feel like it's pretty clear where things are. But I really heavily weigh the tournament matches. I think the tournament matters a lot. I think how you perform in the tournament is really important to kind of where I rank you. And so I do kind of weigh that somewhat heavily. So just keep that in mind when we get into this list. I don't think there's any surprises on here, but I suppose we'll see when we get there. But without further ado, let's jump in and let's get this list started with number 7. At number 7, not surprising anybody, I think I have the Guangzhou Charge. This team has not looked very good so far this season. They have looked pretty weak, despite the fact they do have a win in their first matchup when they played the LA Valiant. I still don't think they have looked good since then. Their differential is atrocious, even though they have that same record as the LA Valiant. Differential-wise, it is really not even close. LA Valiant had a lot more closer matches against a lot of opponents. Charge have just looked weak, all things considered. The Charge with a minus 11 differential, the LA Valiant with minus 5. I mean, it is a massive, massive difference there. Very, very different teams where they've played so far. And so I have to give the edge to the LA Valiant in that regard, in terms of where I kind of would put them on this list, right? Despite them having the same record. Guangzhou Charge have just not looked very good. They haven't looked super put together. They just got rid of Molly. There's reports he's going to the LA Valiant. We don't know for sure yet. But the Charge right now just look kind of discombobulated. I think they have the potential to improve, but right now I'm not really sure what this team wants to do, where this team is at right now. They're very, very, very kind of all over the place, and so it's not a team I'm super, super, super happy with how they've performed so far this season, and so I just have to put them down here at the bottom spot in the APAC region. At number 6, I do not have the LA Valiant. I actually have the Chengdu Hunters. And I know people are going to say, how can you have Chengdu below the Valiant when the Chengdu Hunters have 2 wins, the Valiant only have 1? Obviously, the Valiant did beat the Hunters when they played, but that's not really the only reason why I'm putting Chengdu here at 6. To me, there's a number of reasons why I have Chengdu this low, but the biggest one to me is that they just don't look very good, and they cannot play anything. Their flexibility is terrible. Jinmu is one of the least flexible DPS players we have in the league, and he is the only DPS player they have outside of Leave. Without having a Prita on this roster, I think this team is going to struggle a lot. I really wish they would have held on to a Prita as opposed to promoting Daitzi. I think that the team would have been better if they had just run the 3 DPS, because I think that's what they needed. I think you can make it work with just one tank and you kind of just figure it out as you go. That's what we're seeing as the league has developed. But I think having Jinmu and Leave as your only DPS players has really severely limited this Hunter's roster. I don't think they look very good. Map differential to me is a big sign for how good a team is. And despite having 1 more win than the Valiant, they actually have only a map differential of 1 better. Which means, in theory, they have an additional 3 map wins potentially than the Valiant do. But they don't. They actually have fewer map wins than the Valiant do. So I kind of look at this Hunters roster, and I just don't really feel inspired by them. They have talented players, of course. They have Leave, and they have Monk and Nisha, who we've seen perform at very high levels, and Jinmu can pop off in the right metas. And I think this first kind of stage where we saw a lot of Genji, a lot of Tracer, and stuff like that helps this roster look better than what I think they really are. I don't think they're very good. I think that the lack of flexibility is going to be the end of this roster. I don't think they're going to be able to survive very well. I have very similar problems with this roster as I do some rosters in the West, which we'll get to it, later in this week. But right now, I just really don't feel good about where this Hunters roster is at. They don't inspire me. They don't make me feel confident at all, and so I have them down here at 6. At number 5, I have the LA Valiant. I've actually been very impressed with this LA Valiant roster. I was very hard on them going into the season. I thought they didn't look very good, and I think they're still somewhat one-dimensional with the way Sashin kind of plays and can only play the Zarya really at a high level. But the way I look at it is that is really the only place on this roster I think there is a potential issue. I think what we've seen from the DPS is phenomenal. I think that Dia has looked very, very good. I think that Becky has impressed me more than I expected him to, and those are the two main ones that we're seeing. They're pretty flexible in that DPS line, which helps. Obviously, they have 5 DPS players, so I'd hope you have some flexibility of that many players in your DPS lineup. And I think that they kind of know what they are, and they know what their identity is. Yeah, Sashin's somewhat limited, and he only plays so many things. I think with 5 DPS players on your roster, you can probably find ways to kind of, if you really need to, kind of find players that can play other things. If you want to start, if you want to play Doomfist, you could probably use one of those DPS players on the Doomfist, or something like that, if that's something you really feel like is a necessity. But really, I just think the Valiant have looked pretty consistently decent, obviously. A lot of map 5s in their Kickoff Clash games, only managing to win one match, of course, their final match against the Chengdu Hunters. But they have consistently improved week after week. And I have a big philosophy, and I've talked about this in the past, but I have a very firm belief and a big philosophy that there is one game that I will always look at as exceptions, as things that don't really necessarily speak for what a team is. And it's their first game of the season. Because the first game of the season, there's usually 1 or 2 things that happens. A team either overperforms because they managed to pick up on the meta and the team that they're playing against didn't, or a team underperforms because they didn't pick up on the meta and their opponent had a better read or something like that, because they haven't had stage time yet. They haven't gotten to see really what other teams are playing on stage and see what works and what doesn't work. And you kind of have to get that first stage experience where you're really able to figure out what you are. And so yeah, the Valiant lost their first match to the Charge, but the Charge have looked worse since that first game. The Valiant have looked significantly better. And so I feel pretty good putting the Valiant here in this spot where I think they've looked good. I don't think they're ready yet to punch up and really kind of beat some of these teams from that top 4 and really heavily compete with them. But I think they're getting close, and I think that it is only a matter of time before we look at the Valiant as potentially one of our tournament teams in this APAC region. Number 4, I have the Hangzhou Spark, who despite their strong performance in the qualifiers of the Kickoff Clash, had a very, very, very disappointing performance in the actual tournament itself. Struggling to really do anything in that tournament, losing in the first round to the Philadelphia Fusion in a pretty one-sided affair, 3-1 for the Fusion, and then falling to the Seoul Dynasty in the lower bracket, winning only 1 map in the entire tournament. So they had a pretty poor performance, they had a pretty poor showing. I think really it kind of comes down to the Spark have a lot of talent, and they have that kind of potential to be really, really good. They just can't seem to put it together in some of these big moments when you really want to see them have that star kind of powerful moment. That they really just seem to not know how to play on the big stage. It has been one of the biggest criticisms of the Spark for a while. 2019, we kind of saw that. We saw that a bit in 2020 as well. And then last year, obviously, Junjiao's qualifiers come around. And they lose to a New York team that we all knew was not good. And so that for me is really what I look at with this Spark roster, is that they just don't really seem to have that killer lethal punch that some of these other teams in this region have. Now, that's not to say they're a bad team by any means. I think they're still very good. They're very talented. I think they need to clean some things up and figure some things out. It's one tournament. I'm not going to write this team off yet because they had a poor showing in the first tournament of the season. And I think the Fusion obviously really showed how dominant and strong they are. And of course, the Dynasty looked very good as well, right? The Spark lost to the 2 teams that ended up playing in the finals, right? It's not embarrassing when you lose to 2 teams that do very, very well. So definitely would have liked a stronger performance from the Spark. Would have loved to see them do a little bit more based on what we kind of know that they could be potential-wise when they have star players like ATVI, when they have star players like Gushui. But they unfortunately were not able to hit that high that we kind of expect from them. and that we had seen from them earlier in the tournament. So a little bit of a dip based on their Kickoff Clash performance, but I think that they do have the ability to kind of regain some of that ground and potentially move up in the overall standings, and definitely cement themselves potentially as the #1 team in the APAC region once again. At number 3, I have the Philadelphia Fusion. Now, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with this, or at least some people might disagree with this, because they made the finals. They beat the Dragons during the tournament. They beat the Spark, and then, of course, they lost to the Dynasty, who've been kind of their biggest weakness so far this season. But really, my thing is, I look at this Fusion roster, and the way that they lost to the Dynasty, to me, was rough. Yes, they have been very, very good against Shanghai, and they have done very, very well against Shanghai. But from what I personally have seen of these rosters so far, I don't feel as good about the Fusion to clean up some of their mistakes and fix some of their issues that they have against a team that has looked good like the Seoul Dynasty. Shanghai Dragons are not a perfect team. They made a lot of mistakes. They played somewhat poorly at times during this tournament. But I think Shanghai understands the win conditions in this region. The Fusion have just been besting them so far. I don't know if that'll happen again. Maybe this is a really kind of bad take to put Fusion here at 3 as opposed to higher. But I think the Fusion right now just don't look as kind of dominant against the majority of teams in this region. Sometimes you have a really good matchup against a team, which is what I think the Fusion have against the Dragons. But the Fusion struggled during the qualifiers, right? Against Seoul, against Hangzhou, against the Valiant, against the Hunters, who they lost to. Yes, they beat Shanghai, and yes, they beat the Valiant, and they beat the Charge. But they struggled a lot against other teams in the region. And yes, they bounced back against the Spark. They were victorious during the Kickoff Clash itself. But I don't know if I feel confident in this Fusion to continue being consistently dominant and consistently good. They have kind of flip-flopped quite a bit. They've gone back and forth and back and forth. They had a good week. They had a bad week. They had a good week. Who's to say they won't have a bad week when things come back again? I don't know yet what I think about them. I would prefer a more consistent team in that kind of upper echelon in this region. And so, based really on that alone, I have them down here at 3. They look very, very good, and I think that the meta really kind of favored them a little bit and helped them out a bit. And the fact that they really feel confident just putting Bellisria in and just kind of letting him do whatever he wants. Even though I'm, of course, a huge Fury fan, I wish Fury would get more playtime. I think right now the way they look with Bellisria is pretty good. And so I don't blame them for playing him over Fury most of the time. All in all, I think it's a pretty good team. I think that they definitely have a lot of potential, and they still have a lot of room to grow. Getting second in this tournament with a team of a lot of rookies really is impressive. But I think they're just not quite at the level of these other teams. That's just my opinion, though. At number 2, I have the Shanghai Dragons. This is a team that still looked really, really good. Yes, they've had their moments, and they had some somewhat rough times. There was that one clip, I don't remember exactly what team they were playing, but they were on Eichenwalde, and Fate jumped out of a bubble and then didn't primal, even though he had it when he was low in health, and so he just kind of died. They had some moments like that were just not great. But I ultimately think that this team does still have a lot of really, really, really good potential, right? The only teams that they've lost to so far this season are the Fusion, who seem to just kind of have their number, and the Seoul Dynasty, who every time they play the Dynasty, it's gone to 5 maps, right? It's a close back-and-forth type of series. I think that on Sunday, the Seoul Dynasty happened to be the better team that day. They came to play a little bit more. I think Shanghai made some interesting moves that Seoul countered them pretty well. And so I ultimately do think that this is still a very solid Shanghai Dragons roster. I still feel more confident with them than I do in the Fusion. I think that the Dragons have the flexibility on the DPS line to continue to compete. I still feel very confident in their support line of Izayaki and Lee Jagan. I still think that is probably the best support line in the league, just based purely on players and their talent. So they're still a team that I feel confident in. I don't think they're going to be dominating the APAC region that we saw from them in the past, obviously, but I still feel like they are one of the teams in the driver's seat in this region. We have to acknowledge that. We have to understand that they still have a lot of potential, to come up and be one of those big dominant forces in the league. And so while I don't necessarily think that they right now are the favorites to win the region, I think that their season should only get better from here. They didn't win the first tournament last year, and then they rolled the rest of the season. Would not be surprised to see the same thing happen from them this season. Finally, at number 1, no surprise here, I have the Seoul Dynasty. Like I said during the Shanghai Dragons segment, generally I think that what we saw on Sunday was just an instance of Seoul being the better team on the right day. If Shanghai wins that map 5 against the Dynasty, we have a major different power rankings. We're not necessarily talking about the Seoul Dynasty at number 1. We're probably putting them at number 3. We're putting either the Fusion or the Dragons at number 1, depending on what happens. It would have changed everything, and our perceptions of this entire series and this entire tournament would have been very different. Instead, we are talking about a Dynasty team that came up big when it mattered, Prophet really cementing his legacy as the greatest Overwatch player of all time. And what we saw was the Dynasty really showing that they finally have what they need. They have the duo at the core with Smurf and with Prophet who can carry them potentially to a championship title. Not just a tournament title, not just a stage title, but an actual championship title, because Smurf and Prophet look that good, and Creative and Vendame look on point. Fitz looks on point. This team looks very good, and I think we finally have this Dynasty that we have been promised for years and years and years. They are finally living up to that hype. They're finally living up to the name Dynasty. They look like they actually have what it takes to compete with all of the best teams in the league, because they are one of the best teams in the league. And I think that what we saw from them was dominance against the Fusion, and we saw that when it comes to a team like the Dragons, who the Dynasty have struggled with a lot, they came up big when it mattered most. They didn't back down from the challenge. They didn't back down from the big bad who's been winning all of these things in the APAC region for years now. And so I look at what the Dynasty did. I was very impressed. And so to me, big no-brainer to have them at number 1. I think you could put Fusion, you could put the Dragons. It really comes down to personal preference. Those 3 really are your top 3 in this region. It is a 3-horse race for the top of this region. But right now, I think you have to put the Dynasty at the top, considering they had to run an entire gauntlet of the region to win this tournament, winning against all 3 other teams in back-to-back-to-back matches, and just looking better as they went. So there you have it. There is my power rankings. I will throw the little list up on screen so you can see it for yourself, and you can see where I put all of the teams for the APAC region. It is definitely an interesting ranking, definitely a very interesting region. I was very impressed by what we saw from this tournament in this region. I think this region is incredibly close. It really feels like a region where the best team isn't necessarily going to be the best at all times, but they might be the best in the moment. It might be simply who's the best team this weekend, who's the best team on this one specific day, and that team is a team that's going to win the entire region in that tournament. I'm very excited to see this Eastern APAC region go up against some of these Western region teams in the Mid-Season Madness, but for now, we'll just have to keep watching this APAC region and see where these teams end up. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below on my power rankings. If you agree, if you disagree, let me know. I'd love to hear from you on that. That is going to be all from me for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this in the future. But I'm going to get out of here. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.